I'm Ellis Martin. Thanks for joining me. I usually deal with fact-based reality on this program, no matter what my personal beliefs are concerning politics, the great unknown, and speculation on most anything outside the normal parameters of what is considered reasonable journalism. I usually don't discuss it on the radio show or the podcast, and I won't start now. Having said that, I'd like you to meet Dr. Michael P. Masters. Dr. Masters is a tenured professor of biological anthropology at Montana Tech at the University of Montana. He's taught biological and cultural anthropology, economic anthropology, archaeology, sociology, and cultural diversity at various colleges and universities in central Ohio and southwest Montana. In other words, Dr. Masters is a scientist, an academic, teaching real science. He wrote a book that I happen to read because I have a personal interest in such things. The book? Identified Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary academic approach to the UFO phenomenon. It's available on Amazon, and the audio version is downloadable on Audible. Dr. Masters claims that UFOs are not space aliens from a distant galaxy. They are time travelers from our distant future visiting us for a variety of reasons. You'll hear today in this segment why his theory is in fact very plausible. The ships hovering our skies and taunting our military may be in fact time machines. Michael, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I typically don't do interviews on this program, Mike, related to otherworldly issues, UFOs, ghosts, or anything that goes bump in the night. I discuss fact-based issues, and if it's anything related to science fiction at all, it needs to be science fact. Doesn't mean I don't like science fiction or enjoy a good sci-fi film. I've read hundreds of books as a kid, scores of movies seen. There are many other radio hosts or podcasters who delve into the subject publicly. I listen to them. It's just not me. It's not my thing. Not my wheelhouse as a broadcast journalist. However, I am and have been for most of my life obsessed with time travel. There's a few reasons why, and I may go into it in this program. But again, I wouldn't publicly chat about it on the airwaves without speaking to a scientist, and you are a scientist. I've attended one MUFON conference just once. I have a couple of friends in the space, or I did, so to speak. I thought it was all nonsense, and I could never wrap my head around what I thought was the business of ufology. But for me, it's not been real journalism or science. And here you are, Dr. Masters, the author of Identified Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary academic approach to the UFO phenomenon. You've completely debunked the concept of so-called aliens ever visiting our planet, calling these thousands and thousands of sightings, visitations, so-called abductions, body intrusions, the work of time travelers. These beings with enlarged craniums, smaller faces, no body hair, call them what you will, but call them, please, our biological descendants from the distant future. How did you land at this conclusion? And a short answer is not welcome, sir.
Well, I was actually really young, and I heard a story my father was telling. I was 8 years old, and he was recounting a UFO encounter essentially that he had before I was born, but he was relaying the course of events to some friends that were over at our house that night. And I remember listening from the stairs and just kind of having a sense of wonder and excitement about what he was describing. It wasn't anything that I had any experience with previously. And not long after that, he got a book called Communion by Whitley Strieber. And on the covers, that quintessential archetypal alien form that you just described with the big head and big eyes and small face and whatnot. And I had this thought, kind of this mental image of that alien form, a modern human form, and then what I would come to know as a hominin ancestral form. Just wondering if there could be some sort of phylogenetic connection there, some relationship through time in which they are simply us from the future coming back through time to study their own ancestral past.
So that's where you went immediately at the age of 8, and then you became an anthropologist?
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty serendipitous experience, just kind of a mental image and flash of awareness, I guess you could say. And then, yeah, I decided to pursue it over the next 30 plus years, I guess. What started out in physics and astronomy as an undergraduate at Ohio University in Southern Ohio, and then switched to anthropology about my sophomore, junior year, and finished out with a PhD in biological anthropology in 2009.
How much time did you spend on physics in any of your studies, astrophysics?
Well, early on, even though I switched majors and didn't end up getting an advanced degree in physics, I've always kept up with the literature, especially as it relates to general relativity, special relativity, different aspects of the birth of the universe, cosmology, astrophysics. And it's always been an interest of mine. I guess you'd have to call it more of a hobby, since it's not my main field of study. But even to this day, I definitely follow what comes out in the mainstream media and also with ARVIX and other places where a lot of cutting edge research is being published. So it's still a passion project for me in that regard. It's a really interesting field, especially with quantum computing and just constantly finding out more about quantum mechanics and all of its oddities. It's a really interesting area of study.
I didn't think I was going to do this, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to discuss briefly an experience I had in 1961 where I was in my bedroom in my home in upstate New York, about 60 miles north of New York City, and I had an experience that involved lights and what people like to call anal probing. I don't know what else you can call it. And then for subsequent weeks after that, sometimes in the middle of the night, I would be in a white room with, looked like doctors with smocks on, getting skin grafts. And it never made any sense to me at all my entire life. Never made any sense, and while I was never really infatuated with aliens per se, I've obsessed about time travel, and I've had two experiences in my life. And something about what you just said just completely resonated with that you went straight to that after your father's encounter. Are you positive you were no part of that on any level? You have no memories of anything when you were a child?
I don't actually. I've never even seen a UFO, which is kind of frustrating at this point in my life. But I absolutely commend you for talking about it. And a big part of why I wrote this book was to offer a conservative, down-to-earth explanation for it that would hopefully help break through some of the stigma that's been constructed around this topic over the last 60, 70 years. And I think if more of us did exactly what you just did and came out and described the experiences that we have and not have to worry about how other people view us or just this instant dismissal that we've grown accustomed to in talking about this subject, then we could learn so much more and we could push forward with this. And yeah, the experience you described is so common among thousands and thousands of people all over the world and over long periods of time. And honestly, it really fits into this time travel model well, because as a paleoanthropologist, I've worked all over the world and digging up fossils and artifacts and features. And if we had the technology now to just travel back through time to observe these people and hominins and cultures at the time they existed, we could learn so much more from them. And it really makes sense to me, these abduction reports too, because the things described are exactly what I would do as a biological anthropologist if I had access to these technologies. I'd be taking skin samples and hair samples and fecal samples, which is largely where the anal probing thing likely comes from, and do all of these biomedical examination type things in the same way they're described by people who have had a contact experience. So no, even though I haven't experienced anything even odd that I can remember, I definitely understand just how many people have, and I believe them, and we should all believe them, and especially focus on the consistency across all of these different accounts and understand that these people are looking for answers, trying to find out what's going on, what's happened to them. And the more we talk about it and share these things, the more we can all come to understand the phenomenon better.
I remember asking my mom when I was older, in my 30s, why all the enemas? And she said, what are you talking about? Because that's
a fair question.
That's exactly what it felt like. And, my parents just had no idea. I've also been sort of obsessed with something else that you went into in great detail, closed time-like curves, or CTCs, and I want to talk about that. But before I forget, I grew up, as many of us did, with the Darwinism being the fact. And you support that, although I sort of moved away from it because I couldn't understand how these diverse races were able to just be on the same planet together. We don't get along typically, and we're starting to now, and the races look nothing like each other. But you've explained that, and you've explained it like there's so many different breeds of animals, for instance, that it's entirely possible due to the locales and the environment that people develop as they develop it. So we can't say that this planet was seeded by aliens. According to you, it just doesn't make sense.
No, and if you look at the long history of life on this planet, we can very clearly see how simple gave rise to slightly more complex over 3.7 billion years since the earliest prokaryotes, and then eukaryotes about 1.5 billion years after that. And yeah, there's this long, unbroken chain of continuity across the animal kingdom and across all of the various life forms that exist on this planet. So, yeah, when I hear people talk about how we're the result of extraterrestrials influencing primates or mammals or whatever, we don't need those explanations. It's just adding something extraneous to something that we can already understand in the context of our basic coding system of life, DNA, the nucleotides, and how over time you have different environments selecting for certain traits that are beneficial in those environments. And yeah, over a long enough period of time, it's given rise to all of the tremendous abundance of life and the variety that we see among life forms today.
Is it your contention that our descendants, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years from now, have breeded so much with each other almost in an incestuous way, if that they become dysfunctional and are looking to the past, us, for instance, to reinfuse a more diverse DNA into their future?
It's definitely a possibility. Yeah, it's something I discuss in the book because a lot of what I try to do, like I said, it's a conservative approach to this phenomenon. And instead of trying to speculate about what might happen between now and the future, I mostly just focus on established long-term evolutionary trends in the hominin lineage. What's happened since we became bipedal in the context of long-term morphological changes, cultural, technological changes. And then if these same patterns continue into the future, we are likely to be very similar to what are described as alien beings, or what I call extratempestrials in the book, with the bigger heads, the bigger eyes, small faces, still bipedal, the trait that defines hominins, our lineage, more advanced technology, which has been a dominant trend as well throughout the last 3.3 million years since the first stone tools. But yeah, there's one trend that we see over recent human history, especially the last 500 years, is a homogenization of all of these, what previously were isolated populations, interbreeding groups, isolated gene pools that occasionally came into contact approximately over land, but really beginning with European colonialism about 500 years ago, we've integrated all of those different groups into one large interbreeding population. So if we continue to exist as such, and it's very likely that we will, we would expect to have this genetic homogenization that could eventually, over a long enough period of time, result in a situation of global incest, global inbreeding, where we have certain problems that affect reproduction even. And one of the only ways to get new gene variants might be to go into the past and to sample the genome of individuals and groups, haplotypes that never made it into the future. So that would give us completely novel gene variants that could help us diversify our genome in the future, given that that's the only place they may exist or that we may have access to, especially after we develop the technology to travel backward in time.
So these are fact-finding missions and coupled with harvesting missions potentially, correct?
Well, I think at least the abduction reports they seem to be scientific in nature. They appear to be data collection missions, and really that may be the only overt form of interaction that's allowed in the future. There aren't really paradoxes per se when you travel back in time and visit the past, but it undoubtedly complicates things. It complicates world lines and interrelationships across different periods of time. But outside of that, there very well could be a time travel tourism aspect to it, where they're the ones that we see kind of hovering around the clouds or up in the sky, where there's not overt interaction in the same way that there is with people being picked up in the middle of the night in remote places, where they clearly still try to be somewhat covert in their activities. But there could be a tourism aspect where people pay money to go back and see different periods of time, without interjecting themselves too much into that past. So I think there could be many facets to this phenomenon, but at least the ones where people are really coming into contact with other humans, those would seem to be academic in nature. There seems to be some scientific component to that.
I don't imagine there's a lot of danger in that practice because it's not something we're aware of, although someday I think you alluded to the fact that time travel will just be a natural circumstance of life on Earth, that everybody's going to be as familiar with it as cell phones. Did you not allude to that?
Yeah, no, it's very possible. And again, if everything is self-consistent and we're moving across time in the same way we move through three-dimensional space, we tend to think of time as linear, moving only from past to future. And so the idea that we could visit the past or that we could change the past complicates our understanding of the reality of time. But in the context of what's known as the block universe or block time, which is the dominant model to explain time and space within physics, all of those moments that exist from the beginning of the Big Bang to the very last moments of matter in the universe are all part of one giant four-dimensional block of space-time, where there's still an expansion of the universe, there's still change and movement, but all of those moments, if we could see in 4 dimensions, we could see them as one giant entity. And it's vast, it's enormous. Obviously, everything within our world and within our solar system, but even beyond, the entire universe exists within this 4D block time. So moving in and out of different regions of time, there's connections, there's this sort of web of interaction that exists, but it doesn't violate any sort of laws of causality or matter or mass. It's hard for us to conceptualize, but within the realm of physics, just one giant self-consistent web of interaction. So yeah, we could potentially, at some point, once our species is aware, if this is actually the case, and these are our time-traveling descendants, once we're aware of it, there's really nothing to stop them from just becoming a part of whatever time period they want to. And I mentioned in the book that we could have different temporal races, what I call temporal ancestry, the same way as you described earlier. We have geographic races that look different from one another because they come from different parts of the world that all exist now. We could have people from different time periods who, the farther out from our present, look more different from us, all interacting at the same specific point in time. So yeah, it's very possible that that could be the case in the distant future once we're all aware of who they are and why they're here and what they're doing.
I often think about the 11th dimension being that where all time is now, or it's completely nonlinear and everything extends out from that. And I think that we are evolving into who we're going to be, not only as a species, but as beings. And you refer to intratemporal communication interaction, I believe, and that's when there's actually discussion, if you will, maybe not verbal, but a blend between the future, the past, the present. And this may fall into a discussion about closed time-like curves, which I wanted to have with you. For me, it's a which came first scenario, the chicken or the egg, or bringing the cart before the horse, metaphorically. And I always thought as a deep thinker that we humans are evolving into our future selves. In fact, if you go back into, I don't know what you've done with theology or spirituality, and I'm not a woo-woo Twilight Zone kind of guy at all, but I do like to know why it's so prevalent in our particular culture, and we only have our world to really look at. But the Hebrew letter vav, looking like a hook, it means the word and, if you will, it means connector as well. And in some Kabbalic descriptions, it literally means bringing the future into the past. Reaching into the past, connecting it, and bringing it into the now. And in your book, you discuss the arrow of time being more like a knotted up shoestring where there is no beginning or end. And if I may speculate, time folds over into itself, and that's a natural kind of thing.
Yeah, and really the only thing, if we look at all of the different processes that take place, in physics, they're time symmetrical. They make just as much sense running from future to past as they do from past to future. But there's something about our consciousness that imposes linear time on the universe. And it makes sense. For us to make any sense out of what's happening, we have to see some order to it, where a past cause elicits a future effect. And we learn from that, and it's a standard part of our understanding, our upbringing, our culture. But yeah, in the presence of a time machine, Igor Nabokov, who I cite heavily in the book because he's a brilliant mind and one of the most foremost scholars on time and time travel, points out that the future can actually dictate events that occur in the past, even though it falls outside of our general understanding of this process. But the future can dictate events occurring in the past because the future, present, and past are all one, and none of them are ahead of or behind the other in the presence of a time machine. So if there is an ability to move through time, it completely disassociates us from that linear arrow of time. And you can have reverse causality as we understand it. You can have the future influencing the past, which influences the future. And if you understand it that way in the context of these closed time-like curves and these loops, there isn't a beginning. It's like, I think I said in the book, it's like trying to find the corner of a ball. It doesn't exist. There's no beginning or end to that ball. It's just all one entity. And the same thing exists when you have the ability to travel through time. You can have something create itself. You can have an invention, an idea, if planted into the past, giving rise to that future thing without any real creator, where the past doesn't create the future doesn't create the past. It's just always existed as this self-consistent series of events that are linked through time.
You're saying essentially that technology itself may have reverse engineered itself into existence on several occasions.
It's possible, yeah. In the presence of a time machine, even ideas that could be placed into the past could result in that same idea or something that's produced from it in the future. And an interesting example, whether you believe the Roswell crash happened or not, it still makes for a really interesting thought experiment where if that was a craft developed thousands of years in our future by us with advanced technologies that were derived over that 1,000-year period, if it did come crashing into the desert of 1947, and we were able to study these things and figure out how they worked and how the materials were made, we could eventually develop the same craft that comes crashing into 1947. And then it gets developed again, and then it crashes again. And when that happens, you can't say that the people from the future developed it, because its unfortunate demise in 1947 and the reverse engineering of it is what led to that. But you also can't say the people in 1947 created it, because they were gifted this finished product from a very distant point in the future. But while we see that as a paradox, while it goes against our normal notions of causality, there's nothing about that that's paradoxical. It doesn't violate any aspects of causality. It can just exist as something that nobody really created, but that has always existed.
I know that there's people listening to this program right now that want to ask you, so I'm going to ask, how are these time machines constructed? What is the modality? How many different forms? You must have done some research into that, and I speculate maybe you've spoken to a few people. Explain, if you will, because everything sounds great, but how's it done?
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting parts for me in researching and writing this book, was to really look into what our current understanding of time and the potential for backward time travel might be. And what's interesting is going back to really when we first started to understand time and space in more concrete terms was largely Einstein's contribution, and specifically in 1915 when he published his papers on general relativity. And one of his former advisors, Hermann Minkowski, also contributed a great deal to our understanding of the geometry of space-time. And together, they really put forth a whole new understanding of the way time and space can be warped. And it wasn't long after he put this out, especially his 10 field equations, that people started to realize that there's ways to warp space-time. Joseph Lenz, Hans Thüring in 1918 published a paper demonstrating that massive objects with rotation can warp space-time in the general vicinity around them. So if you take, for instance, a bowling ball and put it inside a tub of maple syrup and you spin that bowling ball, it causes the syrup right around it to also rotate. And that same thing happens with space-time, where you can have a warpage of space-time in association with the rotation of a massive or highly energetic body. And we see this with black holes and neutron stars. And then Van Stockham Godel, Tipler, a number of other researchers over the following decades demonstrated how you can actually do this with physical forms. You can have a rotating cylinder of dust initially, or a rotating universe. Frank Tipler was one of the first, a well-known physicist, the first to demonstrate that a rotating disk of finite length, a ring singularity as he called it, could also create these closed time-like curves. And it doesn't have to be infinitely long or have parameters that aren't obtainable, but it could be the rotation of a massive or energetic ring or disk. And so if you look at the evolution of our understanding of how to warp space-time, you can see this common theme of rotation, mass, energy, magnetism, and we have this expression in biology that form follows function. And if we look at the form of these UFOs themselves, these disc-shaped craft with highly electromagnetic properties, they would appear to also have the function of reversing time and creating closed time-like curves. So it's very possible that the UFO is the actual time machine itself.
I was reminded of another memory thanks to your discussion of the circular movement, and I remember being in an actual centrifuge. I know that's a little bit more out there than the anal probes, but it actually it actually happened. I don't know much of what happened after that, but there was sort of a spacesuit type of garment available, and then a congealing of I don't know if you want to call it an astronaut or a intratemporal, what have you, but that being congealed in red. And I remember in your book you discussed colors on these IFOs, not the UFOs, but they're identified flying objects. And there's something about that bending of light and space that is colorful, because I couldn't understand in my logic why a UFO would need to tool around at night with lights on to begin with. I mean, What's the point of that?
Right. Yeah, I've heard that from a few people, actually. What's with the lights? It seems like they're trying to keep from being observed. So why would they have lights on them? But yeah, in the context of warping space-time, electromagnetism, light being a part of the electromagnetic spectrum, likely has something to do with it, as does magnetism. If we look at it in the context of rotation, light appears to play a role. And certainly light is important in the context of time. It's what allows us to perceive time in certain ways, or how our brain processes the light that's coming into our eyes has to do a lot with consciousness and our conscious perception of time. But it's also the speed limit of the universe. 300,000 kilometers per second dictates not just how fast things can go, but how time passes in your localized reference frame relative to others in relation to that speed limit of light. So yeah, I think light isn't just to see in the dark when they're flying around, but has some pretty strong tie-ins with their ability to traverse time and space.
I'm a journalist, I'm not a scientist, so does light break down atomically like we do? And I'm talking about teleportation. How do these future descendants of ours take us out of a room and put us somewhere else without opening a door or window?
Oh, that's a really good question. I wish I had an answer to it as well. In the book, I'm sure you noticed that when I don't know the answer to something, I'm quick to point that out, or to at least acknowledge that there's some things we can't know. And I honestly have no idea. Because, yeah, you're right. A lot of people describe being pulled through a wall or out a window that's closed. And there's something about the light beam that they're in that allows that to happen. If I had to speculate, and again, this is just speculation, I would maybe guess that they're able to do that by changing the time within that beam of light. If they are able to manipulate time with light somehow, and they're pulling someone through a wall that didn't exist 100 years before, now that wall's not there, and they're able to just move through it. But I honestly have no idea. That's the best explanation I've come up with on the spot here, because it's definitely an amazing ability that we don't have the ability to do now, and probably won't for a very long time.
I like your speculation, though. It makes total sense. And audience, what I can tell you about the book is, when you read it, or if you download it like I did with audiobooks, the detail, the academic attention spent to this without any real woo-woo or speculation. It's all science fact. Of course, you can't really describe time travel any better than we've just done or Dr. Masters has done, but there's no silliness in here. What I don't like about some of these programs, which I've watched on TV, and some of the the conferences I've attended, and I haven't attended many because I'm just bored out of my mind, and I'm with people that just don't have a life. No offense to any of you out there listening to the program, but I know there's probably been some contempt against you when you've attended some of these conferences. Will you continue to do so in the future?
Yeah, no, you're right. There's quite a broad range of people and belief systems at these events. However, I do feel like it's changing and changing for the better. I feel like people are starting to realize that to truly understand the oddities of this phenomenon and to get an idea of what's actually happening and who they are and how they're doing it, that we need to start asking hard questions. We need to demand more from people talking about it. And there's career ufologists, there's people that make money off of saying things and getting crowds at these conferences. And we should be asking hard questions. We should take everyone and what they're saying with a grain of salt, including me and my research. But I do feel like it's changing where people are starting to demand more from the presenters and the speakers and the researchers. And there's still some that just jump on board with whatever some UFO celebrity says, and they buy the things they sell. And that's fine if they're in it for the entertainment. But for those that are serious about this question and trying to get to the bottom of it, yeah, I think we definitely need to look closer at what's being said, who's saying it, what their motivations for saying things are. And in the conferences that I've been invited to speak at, I couldn't believe how many other academics were there, just kind of hiding in the back, waiting in the wings to talk. But there's been quite a few physicists and anthropologists, sociologists, geologists who I've met at my table or after talks at the banquets who are just really interested in this phenomenon and want to know more about it, but like yourself, are looking for a more grounded perspective and not just the silliness that gets bantered around. And it's harmful for the field itself. People aren't going to take it seriously if there's just crackpots saying crazy things, just speculating wildly about things that they have no basis for. It makes it easier for people to dismiss the phenomenon as a whole. And I think to really get this conversation into the mainstream, we have to have a much more conservative approach to it.
Thank you for that, by the way. And speaking of mainstream, while this is not a mainstream program, it does typically deal with financial concerns, commodities, things like gold, silver, platinum, palladium, biotech, things of that nature. And I am attempting to make that bridge between our conversation and the currency of this planet, which is currency. What is the currency in time travel, sir?
Well, it's an interesting question, not one I've thought about until now, but I don't know if we can have an intertemporal currency until there's really broad-based disclosure and knowledge of what's happening. Even in looking at the history of money in the United States, it used to be commodity money where it was the gold or silver itself, and then over time it was fractionally backed, and then there's fiat money, credit money. But it took us standardizing it in our own country in order to be able to use it in different places. And that same thing might have to happen across time as well, where you couldn't just show up 5,000 years in the past and bust out whatever money that you had from that time. You'd have to convert it or go into the archives, probably break into the Smithsonian and rob some displays to get money from whatever time you were about to go to, just to be able to operate within that economic system. But I guess once we had really broad-based intertemporal interaction, you could have exchange rates across different times. Maybe you could have, in the same way where you go across the seas and you go and exchange your money for the local currency there, you could potentially have that with different time periods as well. But that would most likely be in the very distant future, I would think.
Let's bring it home to today a little bit. In our pre-interview, you spoke about being contacted by financial concerns, even NASA.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. It's like I say in the book, I've written it for my academic colleagues just as much as anyone interested in the UFO phenomenon, because I think there's a lot of applications really in different areas of science and economics being one of them as well, where what are the implications of potentially having information from the future influence the past. Or there's the classic example, one of the best movies about it, in fact, was Back to the Future 2, where Biff, I believe was his name, gets a time machine and gives himself all of these stocks and sports teams to pick, and he makes a fortune off of having knowledge from the future. And if we think about this phenomenon in the context of the implications, there's vast implications for anthropology, sociology, the psychology of people who suddenly have to wrap their heads around something very different from their normal everyday lives, and the economics too. What might be the economic influence on the stock market in the present day if these craft just suddenly come busting into our time and say, hey, we're you from the future? What's that going to do to the stock market in a reactionary sense? What's that going to mean for long-term investment opportunities where we see these craft technologies, possibly name brands written on things, where now we know that that's going to be something in the future? At what point does that company exist that we then invest in it to make money off of that thing that we know is going to exist in the future and be profitable? So I think there's a lot of reasons why we should be talking about this in all of these different areas, including finance. And I commend you for having this conversation on your show.
Thank you. Do you think those openings are going to come from the future, or does it take us here in the, I guess, what is the present and the past to reach out somehow? And how can we do that without grasping at straws? But isn't that what science is anyway?
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes back to this whole chicken and egg thing. What do we learn from the future, or what do we do on our own that just becomes something that does exist more linearly without any sort of intertemporal influence? So I don't know. Like I said, it's interesting to think about Roswell, and if that did happen and this was technology gifted from the future into the past, how does that impact its own creation? But on a local level, on a smaller scale, yeah, there could be any number of things that just happen to result in these things in the future. And one thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about beings, hominins, future hominins that look very different from us. And that would indicate that they exist many thousands, possibly tens of thousands of years in our future. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that time travel and our ability to do this exists that far into our future. It could just be that we don't have really any incentive to travel into the recent past. We have archives, we have documents. We don't need to or really want to look at such a proximate period in our own past. So there may be this period between now and a couple thousand years in the future where we do develop time travel technology, but we're afraid of maybe gifting knowledge to people too close to our own time, or there's just really no incentive to look at people or what we're doing in those earlier times. And that may be a part of why we only see beings that look so different, where there's just so much separation that a lot of this information has gotten lost, and they're trying to rediscover the past in the same way that anthropologists do today.
As much as I'm obsessed about time travel, it doesn't make any sense to actually do it into the past. I mean, if you go back to the 70s, you're going to inhale a bunch of cigarette smoke. In the 60s, there's a whole bunch of other issues. Prior to that, there's racial issues. It just doesn't make sense. But does that mean it's not happening yet?
Well, I mean, I guess that's kind of what I was trying to get at is we know what took place in the 60s and 70s and all of the cultural changes. And there weren't really a lot of biological differences that we might be interested in studying. I could be somewhat biased too in my explanation here, because as a paleoanthropologist, I study very distant periods of the hominin past. I worked at a Neanderthal site in southern France that was about 150,000 years old, an Australopithecus site in South Africa that was about 3.5 million years old. And that's where my interest lies. But if you ask that same question to a historian, they might give you a different answer. They might say, oh, there's so much value in going back 50 years and studying what people were doing and how they were doing it. But in the context of archives and records, there really isn't. If we still have access to information in the recent past, there's really no incentive to do it. But in these UFO reports, there are people described as being altogether human. The Nordic characteristics are described a lot. East Asian characteristics are described a lot, but still quintessentially human individuals that look just a little different from us. So, yeah, that could potentially indicate that we're not too far from that potentiality.
And before we wrap it up, if you wouldn't mind giving a brief description of why alien logic and UFOs just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And I always felt uncomfortable as a human being on this planet, like it's not a natural state of being. There's gravity, there's pain, there's issues. Things aren't entirely comfortable being a hominid. And you state that it may just be very, very unique to be a hominid.
Right. Yeah. No, it's an interesting thing to me where I also enjoy science fiction. I've enjoyed it a lot more after writing this book for whatever reason. But yeah, it's funny to me how in all of these different TV shows and movies, the people from different planets are people. They're always people. And that could just simply be because we need actors, and actors happen to be bipedal and have human forms. But they always know how to speak English, and they just have a strange accent, but still very much, they speak English in this star cluster 15 light years away. That makes sense. But no, it's very unlikely that they would be anything like us. And that's for a couple of reasons, very briefly. One is that we have a very unique history on this planet. What it took for primates even to exist. It took the dinosaurs being killed off and mammals to come out from underground with their homeothermy, and then to go up in the trees, and then for us to come down from the trees and to walk bipedally. All of those things are very unique to our lineage, and we're in fact we are the only habitual biped, the only habitually upright walking primate, and it's very rare among mammals as well. So the fact that we don't see it very commonly on this planet indicates that it's probably going to be even less likely on other planets, and especially those planets that have a larger mass than Earth, because you're right, we suffer from a lot of problems with our knees and our backs and childbirth and hemorrhoids and hernias and all kinds of other things that indicate that we're kind of at the upper limit of where you could have a bipedal humanoid form like ourselves. So and most other planets discovered as part of the Kepler mission are quite a bit larger. Earth is smaller or as big as only 2% of all of the other planets that have been discovered. So they're all much bigger than planet Earth, which indicates that our form of locomotion, what defines us as a species, as hominins, isn't likely to exist on other planets and other star systems.
So dolphins just aren't going to time travel or get on a spaceship and warp drive.
Well, you're right. There's other things too, like the free use of our hands. The reason we are so sophisticated, or a big part of it's because we stood upright too. So yeah, it'd be hard for them to type on computers or make spaceships with their little flippers. You're right. They're incredibly intelligent, as are many other mammals, and non-mammals as well. But yeah, they're just not likely to look like us or be able to do the things that we can do with our highly dexterous digits that, again, are the result of bipedalism.
The book is Identified Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary academic approach to the UFO phenomenon. Dr. Masters, Michael, thank you so much for joining me today on the program.
Thank you. It's been really great talking to you. I appreciate it.
Once again, I've been speaking with Dr. Michael P. Masters, anthropologist and author of Identified Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary academic approach to the UFO phenomenon. This incredible book is a must-read or listen, available on Amazon and also downloadable on Audible. If you have questions or comments on this segment, send them to me, martinreports@gmail.com, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter by going to the website, ellismartinreport.com. I'm Ellis Martin.